Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think for too long we've allowed large MNCs which control the flow of information, which control the entire media industry, to at best allow for like rampant misinformation that turns voters against the very democratic mechanisms that keep bad actors in check. At worst, they actively perpetuate this misinformation and allow quasi-dictators or people who want to pervert the democratic process to gain power and stay in power. What we're going to do on our end is to break up companies like Facebook, for example, which not only possess the largest social media network, but also the largest photo sharing service in Instagram, as well as the largest messaging app in WhatsApp. We're talking about conglomerates like Fox, which control not only Fox News in the United States, but also through complex ownership structures, various newspapers like the Wall Street Journal in America, as well as if I understand correctly, News Corp, like they have ties to News Corp, which also owns like papers in Britain, in Australia, and in other parts of the world as well. There is also going to be a section in our case that talks about non-media companies, and I'll get there in a bit. What we're going to do when we split them up is that we're going to split each constituent part, right? Because the conglomerates, they have subsidiaries in various industries or in various parts of the industry. So Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram will all have to split. But even within a particular sub-industry, we will try to split Facebook, for example, or WhatsApp into several entities as well. And in order to enforce this, you will need to ensure that the ownership structure of each of these subsidiaries is different, that independent directors are put onto the board of these constituents as well, so on and so forth. The first reason why we want to do this is that for too long, these companies have, at worst, as I said, actively engaged in misinformation, at best, allows for misinformation. So at worst, we've got conglomerates like Fox News spreading misinformation over what Trump does or does not do, or like whether Hillary Clinton was really guilty of launching conspiracies against the government, so on and so forth, right? At best, you've got companies like Facebook, which through their algorithms, allow people to continue seeing content that panders to existing or preconceived beliefs, that allow them to upvote as well as preferentially access content that is intentionally misleading without regard to whether this information is true or not. And sometimes they even sell the data of their customers to political organizations or political consultancies like Cambridge Analytica, so that they can feed them more misleading political ads, so that they can keep voting for the same candidates that spew such misinformation and weaponize this misinformation to stay in power. And the worst part is there are no alternatives, because they enjoy market dominance such that the markets themselves are not contestable, so no future company can go in, but there are no companies that can currently contest them sufficiently anyway. I think Fox News is easily the largest news corporation in the United States, for example. Some of the others like CNBC or NBC just don't compare. The impacts of this are threefold. The first is that voters are incentivized to vote against their own interests on various policies, and that's the least bad harm. So when they claim, for example, that they're not actually cutting your Medicare, when they are, that represents huge harms to an entire swathe of the population who rely on government subsidized healthcare, but they're going to vote against their interests because they believe such misinformation. Secondly, that there is a perversion of the process, of the democratic process through fake information. So for example, if you say that the Democrats are going to misuse the United States Postal Service for some sort of conspiracy, and you use that as a justification to cut funding to the USPS, even though in this particular coronavirus laden era, you require mail-in votes in order for the democratic process to function smoothly. That's how the democratic process gets perverted. Last but not least, you basically threaten fundamental rights because of misinformation. You claim that COVID is a hoax, that it's not as bad as it actually is. People don't wear masks, and as a result of that, you cause deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans, as well as the long-term suffering and permanent disability of millions more who contract the virus, for example. Our alternative is simple. Worst case scenario, sure, all media companies or all subsidiaries do the same thing, but at the very least, they don't have central access to the data of their customers, it's all split up between different companies. And that means that they cannot weaponize this data to sell to third parties as easily. Their algorithms will be less precise in providing these customers access to the same old misinformation. That's one. And of course, it's harder for this for media companies or companies that rely on social media sites to be able to spread their tentacles throughout all the different subsidiaries at once. Best case scenario, however, some companies compete on data privacy, they take a significant chunk of market share, they ensure that the harms that of misinformation to a large proportion of the population get mitigated because you don't have access to the same customer base. You have some companies or some subsidiaries that actively go against the policy of implementing these algorithms for profit motives in the first place. The second thing I want to talk about is about general lobbying. So even if we don't talk about media companies, there are active harms caused by oil companies, for example, becoming too large and having great lobbying power. Before I move on, however, I'm going to take closing opposition. So I mean, presumably whatever mechanism, I'm not really too concerned about it, right? If it means antitrust lawsuits, that's one way to go about it. If it means if it's just fiat, I think that works as well. Of course, there might be hiccups here and there, but arguably we comparatively have more benefit. Allow me to explain why that's the case. The problem is that large MNCs have a lot of money to lobby regulators to loosen antitrust regulations, for example. So even if you think that antitrust lawsuits are imperfect, at the very least, on the comparative, we do something to prevent these regulations from becoming even weaker in the long run, or they might put weaker political regulations in terms of verifying accounts to make sure they're not fake or they belong to foreign actors, or just general regulations with regard to, let's say, oil companies or coal companies lobbying against climate change friendly regulations. And that's important, right? Because that ensures that our regulations can serve their purpose, and B, more importantly, it allows us to put in policies in the future to prevent existential threats like climate change from becoming too great. And we need to be able to weaken their coffers, which is what we do on our end by reducing their market share and reducing their share of the profits. But even if industries lobby as a whole, we think that it is more likely that the needs of various firms in the industry will be heterogeneous. They don't always align, and it's easier to be able to divide and conquer these individual lobbyists rather than attempt to take on a hegemon within the industry as a whole. Because we have benefits for lobbying in general, but because we crucially deal with the problem of there being far too much misinformation in the media industry, we think that even if our policies are of limited benefit, this is a problem that is too big to ignore, and nothing else matters beyond this. For those reasons, vote for opening government.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the speech. Can I call upon the Leader of Opposition?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. So I think there are broadly two clash points that come from opening opposition. Number one, it is simply to ask whether or not the subjective nature of this quote-unquote threat to democracy justifies the capacity to break up companies. But secondly, even if it did, why the specific mechanism of being able to break up this corporation is likely to be effective at all in trying to protect democracy. I'm going to engage them on two fronts. A lot of the responses will be integrated. But the first thing I want to clarify is what the difference is between the consumer welfare and the threat to democracy as to why we're willing to stand by consumer welfare. It is precisely the fact that you can have econometrics, you can have many quantifiable measures as to the reasons for which you could say that something harms consumer welfare, i.e. does it overall decrease the capacity for production? Does it decrease affordability, and would we have otherwise have had higher prices in the instance that there was a greater degree of competition, not such a large monopoly or like a large trust, in order to ensure that consumers would be better off? But I don't think the same standard exists with regard to the threat to democracy. And I think that's the first thing I want to point out. It is precisely the fact that there are incredibly differing versions as to what the conception of democracy is, and it's therefore unclear to me whether or not open government is likely to be able to get their goal. And like there are many reasons or examples to show this. One is the capacity to have algorithms that allow you to be able to have echo chambers, etc. An anti-democratic process, or is it part of the democratic process to be able to associate with other individuals just like you? Is the capacity to have fake news, something that is inherently evil or ought to be left in the air on social media rather than be left to alternative sites where we can not be able to correct them, or we cannot tell people that these things are wrong? Thirdly, is the capacity to lobby and donate to corporations an extent of free speech, or is it a proper, rather an affront to democracy in all instances? So I think in the instance where you're unable to ensure what a threat to democracy is, it is precisely the opposite of what I think we offer to governments in this scenario. It is a top-down change to be able to ensure that this threat to democracy, using uniquely the specific mechanism of being able to break down corporations, something that is I would say even more so anti-democratic. And it is different from any other regulatory mechanism. You can punish maybe 1 or 2 or 3 individual actions that corporations may be able to do. But the active threat of breaking them down is one that a corporation will never have the capacity to adjust to, and at the same time could precisely be anti-democratic in nature. What are instances of this, right? I would say one of the reasons that these kinds of trusts exist is because of the high initial incentive to be investment required to be able to have, for example, a lot of the large server capacities that Google or Facebook or Amazon might be able to have. It might be more democratic to ensure that people have a free and accessible capacity to be able to access news on Facebook, the capacity to voice out their opinions, the capacity to express themselves politically on a social media platform. But in the instance you harm the most capable actor of being able to provide these things, just because of an action or two that deem them to be anti-democratic and therefore cannot cater to the same number of consumers, it's unlikely that they can achieve the same goal of a democratic process. So even if this was done fairly, it's unclear to me why it was likely to be an effective mechanism. But secondly, we don't think it'll always be done fairly, precisely because the conception of democracy is one that is subjective in nature and can be massively politically motivated. So it could be the Trump administration being able to actively break down Twitter because they've done many actions that oppose them, but not Facebook because it was crucial in the Cambridge Analytica instance being able to ensure that the election process would favor Trump. What is perceived as democracy is subjective enough to be able to ensure that you could have selective methods of being able to ensure one company would break up and the other would not be able to. In the instance that is true, I would say that it leads up to far more anti-democratic process and is hard to be able to oppose because of the nature of the policy that exists then. Before I move on, I'll take opening opposition. Or government, rather.
So all these checks and balances that we put in any constitutional democracy, like ensuring minority rights are respected, or the election commission ensuring that there's no gerrymandering, all of this is in some way politically subjective anyway. But that doesn't mean that we don't make do with all of these things because they're necessary.
No. I think you make a difference here with the mechanism that you're going to be able to use, right? It is precisely the fact that it is just the broad capacity to say something is a threat to democracy, to be able to justifiably break down entire corporations which might be politically suitable to you or might be economically viable for your administration or for your political allies, etc. That we think then is a dangerous threat to power that you're able to have. But secondly, I just simply want to prove why we'd rather prioritize things like consumer welfare over democracy in general. So I would make the claim that because of the subjective nature of being able to protect the democratic process, but the very universally applied and the shared need to be able to do things that provide for your own basic necessities, have work, have lower prices for goods, etc., are things that are necessarily agreed upon and on consensus, very, very necessary for a lot of individuals. The first thing I want to note is things like climate change are just out of this debate. I don't think it is fair to say that we have to stop climate change because this uniquely about democracy. I don't think this large existential threat that they talk about is linked to democracy at all. But secondly, it is the capacity to have the most efficient and best firm to be able to act in a way that is most economically viable that I think is important. And I think this policy breaks that up. Why? For one, it is the capacity to have things like shared resources, the capacity to subsidize from other parts of your corporation maybe, to lower prices initially and ensure that there is better consumer welfare at all. Secondly, I think this scares off the capacity for large firms to be able to grow. And a lot of the methods for growth are often quite crucial for consumer welfare. Things like further innovation and better new products to be able to ensure that they increase their market share. Things like being able to lower your prices to be able to ensure that people are better off in the long term. I think then, precisely because of the very scary nature of what is quote unquote a threat to democracy, ensures that we have less and less actions that are likely to be able to ensure that they benefit consumers overall. And I think it's quite important. Number one, because we already clarified that this specific mechanism could lead to further breakdown in democracy. For the same reasons that access is quite important, work is a very important prerequisite to democracy to ensure that you cannot simply be bribed, that you simply you can have the basic economic standing to be able to ensure that you have a vote, people have more access to information, etc. But moreover, even without that kind of benefit, it is more so important because these are far more crucial, the basic needs of an individual, like being able to provide for themselves, like ensuring that their basic necessities can be afforded. And in a world that is increasingly being integrated with data, with information, with the online market, I think then it is incredibly crucial that we prioritize the most efficient providers of these kinds of services rather than be able to break them up, because I think then that is a secondary benefit to a lot of the economic benefits that I think we ought to provide coming from opposition. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank Leader of Opposition. May we have Deputy Prime Minister?
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Second. Starting in 3, 2. Sorry. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the problem with opening opposition is that they ignore a lot of the structural and specific harms that is enacted when conglomerates currently exist, particularly because it's not just about allowing discourse, as they mentioned, but it's about the kind of discourse that exists on these platforms. At a point in time where the kind of discourse is toxic at worst, but actively disproportionately affects democratic processes at best, I think that is what we need to really tackle. And I think those are the things that I think we really need to care about in terms of allowing people to access these things, but in a manner that actually ensures that they have their freedoms in terms of what they can speak about. Okay, I want to talk about two things, specifically in way of rebuttal. Firstly, I want to talk about the degree of threat and the possible subjective nature of this law. And secondly, I want to talk about the biases. And lastly, I want to talk about the harms that could potentially exist before moving on to some positive material about why this model is far better than the one that we have in status quo. First, on the degree of threat, right? The stuff that we hear from OO is that the main claim is that democratic threat to democratic process is such a subjective idea. Whereas for consumer welfare, it's very simple, right? It's you can see decrease in prices and economic efficiency and stuff like that. Couple of responses to this. One, I think even in the case of consumer welfare, I think even establishing things as economic growth is a very subjective thing as well. I.e., you have to still make varying judgments when breaking up companies under consumer welfare with things such like equity, for example, or the degree of profit that they're necessarily allowed to have, because it's entirely a subjective metric. And even things such as the market concentration or market size that they have are all things that you necessarily do take note of. But you do so in a very subjective manner because there's no specific metric that necessarily exists. But secondly, even if it's subjective, right, I think threat to democracy has certain markers that we think we still can establish on the outside of the house. These are things like, for example, the ability of these institutions in status quo to take down viral misinformation. B, the usage of political ads by these institutions. C, the lobbying power that exists within companies like Facebook and Twitter, for example, in terms of how their ad policy is or in terms of what their content policy is and stuff like that. These are specific ways in which you can check the threat to democratic process here. So I don't really think it's just because it's a broad claim of democratic process, therefore it means that we can't legislate those things. I think there are specific ways in which we can legislate those things. Obviously, there's a degree of subjectivity involved, but insofar as a lot of things that we curtail in terms of what the state does is subjective, I think what we should do is not to like ignore that altogether, but ascertain a level of subjectivity that we think is reasonable. I think the reasonable level of subjectivity is the stuff that Adil talked about, right? The ability to curtail like misinformation, for example, the ability to prevent viral stuff from going like quickly from platform to platform, the ability to prevent like large scale like data farming by these institutions who then sell it to third party providers, for example. These are all specific ways that we can legislate the law to make sure that these harms don't accrue. So therefore, this idea of subjectivity is inherently a very weak one. I think the difference is that even if access to the app, even if someone access to the app, right, it's not going to be contravened on outside the house. I.e., like even if Facebook breaks up and only exists as Facebook, and therefore doesn't have the connectivity to Instagram and like, you know, WhatsApp, for example, people can still access it. They're not prevented from being accessed. And while all may be in favor of discourse, they're not like, the discourse doesn't happen in a positive way because the difference is more about what kind of, or how that discourse necessarily happens. Secondly, on the idea of bias and political motivations, right? They say that, you know, like what this is going to create is that like the states will decide arbitrarily which one to break up and which one not to break up. Three responses. First, I think bias exists like symmetrically on both sides. And I think they are using, the problem with bias on their side of the house is that the existing biases are made worse because of the way in which companies are necessarily structured as conglomerates, right? This looks like Trump's like political team, for example, sharing false information on social media, and it's spreading very quickly because of the conglomerate nature of like sites like Facebook or Twitter, for example. I think things actually get worse under their model, i.e. the bias becomes worse because lobbying is so much easier to do in a world where like you can easily spread misinformation across multiple platforms at the same time. On our side of the house, we acknowledge that bias exists, and that's true, but it can be better curtailed by regulation, right? So Trump on our side of the house may be wanting to break up Twitter first, but if he chooses to give Facebook a free pass, for example, there's going to be enough online voices to like suggest dissent against this and claim that and criticize the actions of the administration, for example. We are living in a world where it's far easier to criticize the actions that states take, and if people see that states are taking actions in a way that's undemocratic or uncharitable, for example, I think there's enough mechanisms to call it out. Lastly, on some stuff about like economic stuff, right, like price and growth, for example. Two responses. One, I think companies can still survive, like even if they are broken up. Like Facebook was doing pretty well, like before its acquisitions anyway. And the reason why growth is hurt, right, on their side of the house is because Facebook can no longer make as much money from like taking people's data as they used to, or Facebook can no longer become like a viral misinformation piece or viral source of spreading narrative, for example. That is the thing that we lose out, but we are okay with losing out those things insofar as there are a lot of harms associated with growth and a lot of harms associated with like them becoming bigger conglomerates. I don't think growth is necessarily an inherently good thing because op doesn't structurally or necessarily explain to you why growth is a good thing. We told you that growth is a bad thing for a couple of reasons. Now, why this model will be better off when companies are broken? I think the problem here is with online discourse, right? I think online discourse has gone to shit over the past decade due to the nature of things like virality and the effect that conglomerates have. But before I move on to this, CEO. Okay, how does Amazon harm democracy? I think they harm democracy in terms of like how they, for example, like stop a lot of companies from accessing, break up a lot of companies, for example. They harm democracy in terms of the lobbying things that they do necessarily to prevent certain things in price caps and regulation, for example. They also use like their like Amazon Prime like platform and other areas to shape the discourse and shape narrative. I think I'll extend on this, right? The narrative is controlled by people that you don't even know, or at worst are bots, right? This relies in the ability to aggressively sway people to think in a certain way, right? This looks like bots, for example, like using bots to create racist and anti-racist sentiment at the same time in the pages of like countries having elections like Burma or the United States, for example. This is also lobbying groups preying on analytics and divisive confirmation to fulfill political goals. Secondly, also it leads to whitewashing of political corruption, right? Politicians using social media to sanitize their image is something that they can do easily because of the way in which these conglomerates are structured in a way that allows virality to happen as fast as possible. What does breaking up create? It creates three outcomes. One is splitting them up, make it harder for corporations to access your data, right? On our side of the house, when Facebook and Instagram are like have different CEOs, different boards of directors, they have independent directors to balance out potential threats to the democratic process, it makes the ability to sell data to third parties less lucrative as a result because you don't have like collective data, for example, and Facebook and Instagram have their own separate data. I think it functions better. Secondly, you also control the viral spread of misinformation because you make it harder for lobbying teams to rely on companies to spread information quickly, and it's likely that the apps go back to their initial function rather than existing as tools for political goals. Lastly, I think it also curtails lobbying power in corporate areas as well because it's harder for you to use these like tools as a mechanism for you to espouse certain aspects of your like regime or certain aspects of yourself that you want to sanitize at the expense of like voters' confidence, for example. I think for all of these reasons, we should break up these companies. I'm very, very proud to propose.
Thank you. Can we have Deputy Leader of Opposition?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. Just give me a few seconds. Okay. I want to be very clear. There are two ways the opposition bench can win this debate. First is to explain why this technology or why this policy will likely be misused and why that misuse is not worth the trade-off of a potential saving of democracy. But secondly, even if we concede the goal that we ought to fight the threat to democracy, and secondly, concede to the best case of opening government, which is that they will use this properly, the goal of fighting for democracy or fighting for the is far better on the alternative models and not the model coming from the opening government. Firstly, why do we think it is likely to be misused? We suggested that the threat of democracy or democracy is a very, very subjective thing that can be determined or can change depending on the particular stakeholders or the interpretation of the government. What was the response? They said that consumer welfare is also subjective. I don't want to let them muddle the debate, and I want to be very clear about the difference, right? When you're measuring consumer welfare, you do things like measuring the output of goods and services, measuring relative prices over a period of time, measuring things like how much you produce in a particular period of time. All of these are objective metrics that you can quantify and that you can observe. I agree with what Subra said. It is possible to have differing thresholds of what consumer welfare is. So you might say that a $2 increase is different from a $1 increase, but the important part here is that everyone agrees generally on what metric you should be using, i.e. that there is a price you should be computing, that's what you should be measuring in that regard. This is important because at best what their policy does is it reduces cases in the middle ground, right? The middle ground where it's somewhat subjective whether or not something is abusing corporate welfare. But in the extreme cases or the more important cases where they're very abusive of their position, we're able to determine that on our side versus under your side where threats to democracy are not only subjective of how you measure them, but a lot of times the metrics are contradictory. Do you measure it by how many people are willing to speak out? Do you measure it by how many people are willing to vote? Do you measure it by how many instances of information or what you consider truth is? All these are contradictory. That's why this level of subjectivity is significantly greater, and that's why the propensity for abuse is significantly greater under their side of the house. Note that if people or populist leaders who want to be dictatorial, who want to take down their potential opposing media sites that go against them, they can now use this as a justification to take it away from them because they say that they are talking about against the government, deciding to cause instability, and therefore it's a threat to democracy as a whole. We would suggest if you want to risk this strategy, given that breaking up companies does not only harm the people who own the company, but rather the entire economic system as a whole, we don't think this is a justified standard for them to use this policy at the very beginning. But let's take them at their best case. Let's assume that regulators are fair and it will only assess it on the basis of the threat to democracy. Why are they still worse under their side? I want to be clear about this issue. If you're uncertain about whether or not there's a threat to democracy, you have to give this debate, whether not able to successfully deal with the threat to democracy, you have to give this debate to negative bench. Because aside from the fact of the issue about threat to democracy, we gave you the trade-off of this, right? Why the economic well-being of your state is significantly harmed. We suggested that if these are good monopolies, because they're not harming welfare by definition, then presumably they make prices cheaper, they make goods more efficient, they improve the technology and therefore provide a lot of these services. We suggest that it's not only the harm to companies, right, but future companies would be thinking about whether they should grow, whether they should expand investment, whether they should buy out other companies to develop their company, are all likely to be disincentivized because if they have a subjective threat or a specter of them being potentially broken up for some random reason because a threat to democracy, we would suggest that they're far less likely to grow. The response coming from Subra is, well, they can still survive because even if you break up Facebook, it will still be relatively big. It's not about whether or not the company survives, but rather the added benefits of being a large stakeholder in a market or having a large market share. There's things like your ability to make goods free, like Facebook free, or make your news free because you have mass volume that allows you to make your money back by ad revenue. Or things like you going to remote areas because now you have the capital to invest in there, or otherwise smaller companies would not been able to invest in there. Or things like your goods being cheaper. And notably, if the motion is not only about media companies, which are also important, by the way, if you have access for services, because there are things like news, which are important in the daily lives of people. There's things like access to basic goods and services. If you're a health provider company, this is literally the development of your technology or the marginal changes in your technology. It's important to keep people alive. This is a trade-off that they have to deal with. If you're uncertain about judging the debate on the threat to democracy, we take the debate already. But secondly, even if you're somewhat certain that Gov is better at dealing with the threat of democracy, they don't respond to the weighing mechanisms provided by Miko, and closing government has to respond to the weighing mechanisms I provide now. The fact that threats to democracy are relatively subjective. People debate about whether or not something is a threat to democracy. Not everyone agrees it to be important, but presumably everyone wants cheaper prices. Presumably everyone wants better technology because this allows them to develop themselves. This allows them to empower themselves. But secondly, note that there's a convoluted process of what the threat to democracy is. There are multiple steps for one company to affect the elections. It's so easy to draw causal link between saying Facebook made Hillary lose, but presumably there are a lot of other factors involved that made Hillary lose. We would suggest, in comparison, consumer welfare has a direct harm to people. That is to say, people, the prices of goods being expensive, electricity being expensive, you don't have access to medicine, directly kills people, directly harms individuals, and therefore it's a more important claim. The last thing I want to note here is that a lot of the basis for the freedoms of what you call democracy are contingent on people's material needs being sufficiently met out first. In a world where the breaking up system harms those material needs, you would suggest they're significantly worse off under their side. But let's go beyond all of that weighing. Let's assume that the threat of democracy is the most important, because that's where we'll destroy opening government and therefore win this debate. Note that the comparison is not break up under their side versus do nothing under our side if people are bribing or if people are cheating, etc., etc. Assuming the government is good enough for you to be able to properly regulate it, then presumably all the laws they say can be regulated under our side. If you think that fake news is an absolutely bad thing, that you can potentially ban fake news, it is unclear why it is necessary for you to break up companies under their side. Their only response is to say, well, economic power is linked to political influence, and therefore you're not able to regulate these companies if they're too big. Notably, your ability to regulate people or break up companies is contingent also on political power, right? Or you having strong enough political capital. Because you can technically break up a large company, but if you don't, you'll have subsidiaries that are relatively linked. What is independent is subjective, and therefore, to a degree that Gov has all the political capital to break up these companies, we presumably have all the political capital to regulate these unfair behaviors. The mutually exclusive difference, however, is that we're not harming the rest of the economy. We're not destroying jobs. We're not destroying the efficiency and access to consumers by the process of this policy, but we're actually just punishing the people involved. But notably, the incentive to restrict or regulate democracies diminishes under their side. Because at the point at which we say it is large corporations who are blamed or to be blamed for all of these problems, at the point where we break them up, we create a sense of complacency where people no longer feel like the democracy is a threat. We would suggest it is better our world or far more critical, not of just them being large corporations, but the fact that anybody could be a potential threat to democracy and regulate on that behavior. That is why it's either you don't believe that this is an important enough issue to be the trade-off, or B, you believe it's an important enough issue that their mechanism is not able to solve in the most optimal manner. And for those reasons, we're very proud.
Thank you for that speech. Can we have member of government?
I'll hold up my phone because it's been a bit wobbly recently, so it should be okay. All right. By this point in the debate, opening government really hasn't answered that question of where the boundaries of democratic rights lie and how exactly you draw the line. We think at closing government, we're going to provide two really explicit instances of where this is important. The first is that wonderful protection that exists in most constitutions across the democratic world, that is the right to privacy, and why that is specifically and calculably infringed upon in many situations by large conglomerates, particularly tech companies, and we'll explain some unique benefits and mechanisms there. And the second we'll talk about is the foreign policy implications of the exporting of violence and of illiberal rights by a lot of these companies when they fail to have this sort of regulation and breakup occurring. Let's talk about exactly what we're going to do. We say that the only way to effectively establish whether or not these companies violate it is to look at things like democratic rights, to look specifically at the right to privacy, because it is the easiest one to evaluate. Why is that the case? Well, you look at all the different standards that exist under the status quo, the fact that Europe has a really strong data privacy system, which evaluates exactly certain rights you may have to the withholding of your data, the protection of your data, and the control of your data. The fact that you have to have data localized onshore. The fact that companies can't, not as oppositions to government say, sell your data off to third parties, but can't host your data in different countries by virtue of being a multinational corporation, which the vast majority of these significant companies and large companies are. So we're talking about specific protections and specific rights that are judicially applicable, that have a long tradition of being upheld and clearly evaluated. So that answers that very clear challenge from opening opposition as to whether or not it's actually possible. Let's briefly have a chat about some of the benefits that opening opposition give quite feebly, really. I was expecting a bit more material on why these, ostensibly extremely economically damaging conglomerates are actually beneficial. So I'll deal with that briefly, then I'll present my extension. So it's this first question of the objective economic nature of these companies and whether they're beneficial. And it really came straight out of this Stanford libertarian economic think tank, which is to say that obviously in the short term, it is calculable. Like, I know what prices of milk are likely to be next week. I know roughly how these companies are likely to operate. But two things. First, you cannot price the loss of data, and you cannot price a lot of the things that tech companies are selling, something that wasn't really acknowledged by either opening team. That's a pretty obvious point. And the point there is that a lot of the benefits of Facebook amorphously are very, very difficult to calculate. But secondly, and importantly, you can actually attribute changes in prices to other factors. There was a recession, there was a boom, there was a bust. These are things you can't actually, approximate or evaluate in the long term. So it means it creates a very easy excuse and makes the bar extremely high to actually split up companies that are very economically damaging. But the second and more important point is that sure, it may in the short term be beneficial to have one large conglomerate, but there are a variety of ways in which monopoly specifically can behave. So if you monopolize a company, you are a monopoly, and you're a large company, you monopolize a company, you have no competitors. So you can set whatever price you like, and there is no alternative. Or as Amazon does, you can preference individuals using your actual platform to gain profit because you also own the individuals and the companies using that platform specifically. The point being is that, maybe according to the assessment of of these regulators, in the short term, you're actually benefiting people because you're offering low prices. But there's no long-term trend to suggest that's going to be the case. And as I've explained, there are a huge number of complicating factors that make it incredibly difficult to assess that. And there's an enormous amount of corporate capture, which means you can actually kind of twinge and affect the judgment of regulators on those particular issues because you can, shroud it in that sort of economic analysis. So it's actually a direct flip of opening opposition. Yes, price is theoretically clear, but having a pinpoint analysis of the way price works is incredibly unclear. So what that therefore means, right, is there are a lot of companies that are incredibly economically damaging, companies that are setting way higher prices than they otherwise would, Amazon, etc., and companies that just don't sell anything, like Facebook, like Google, etc. So you can't really talk about this. It's only advertising revenue, and there's no way to split them up. So none of the benefits opening opposition have really talked about because they rely heavily on goods and services, for instance. But we explain that the benefits here are quite amorphous. They're the network benefits of being able to talk to some friends or no friends. So now I'm going to explain why privacy is significantly more important than the potential benefits of having these sort of networks. So what are we talking about firstly on data privacy? We think that data privacy is incredibly important, and specifically how this policy works, for a few reasons. The first reason, and important reason, is that you can't have preferences if they're being supervised or being overseen. So the fact that companies have the capacity to shape your preferences, which is not explained actually by opening government. They say, there's been some instances of companies shaping preferences. But the obvious example is that you're able to target specifically data across a huge number of sources in a huge number of countries, and to articulate what their preferences are and to direct them in certain ways in order to make more ad revenue. That's the mechanism in the model which actually occurs, means that you're undermining your fundamental rights rights there. The second thing and the important thing is that you can house that data wherever you like. So often there's an incentive under the status quo to house your data in places that are the easiest and have the lowest regulatory burden. That's important to know, because what it means is that your data is vulnerable to being hacked. People can steal your information. There's a huge amount of fraud that can occur. You can have a huge undermining of the democratic process because other third-party actors aren't buying your data. They just hack your data and have access to that data. The third thing is that if you have huge infringements upon your data rights, for instance, the way in which certain government entities capture your data and collect your data, you have no way to actually sue and defend your rights because it's an international crime. It's committed in a different jurisdiction. You have no rights or capacity to actually prevent that. So what the point is there, right, is that is really important because data is essential to your democratic rights. But secondly, you're not getting fair compensation for the way in which these companies operate, because these companies are able to extract huge amounts of data and make a huge money on advertising revenue, and you're selling yourself for a price you don't actually know. Because realistically, you're getting access to a very fringe benefit, but the benefit of data privacy in the long term, of not having your identities leaked, of not having yourself surveilled, of knowing how much that information is actually worth, is incredibly abstract and long term. So you have no capacity to actually assess that. And what that means is you're essentially being ripped off massively in the context of that economic benefit. I'll then explain the importance of weighing of this argument and then get into my second argument about exporting violence. But I'll firstly take a point of information from either of the government teams, sorry, the opposition teams. So the question, if for privacy is enshrined in constitutions, is it because there are myriad of laws? Why is it better to have your mind? Okay. Oh yeah. So the first thing I was trying to say there, which is quite obvious, is that you're forcing a company to be, you're often going to split these companies up based on their location. So you're going to have a US branch of like ByteDance, for instance, and that's like one example of how this sort of policy would work. So the idea is you're actually applying it domestically. It's a mutually exclusive benefit. The second and important thing, right, is when companies are forced to compete, if you have alternatives, and this is like the important mechanism that OG just never explains, like competition is a really important, like it's essential to any breakup companies debate. Having competition means that if one company screws over your privacy and the other company doesn't, then you choose the company that offers the best package. Because while amorphously you don't recognize that, if one company is able to brand itself as saying, look, we're offering a far better privacy deal, we're much better enshrining your rights, we encrypt your data, etc., etc. That's incredibly valuable and important, because what it means fundamentally is that you're able to then have that access to that right, which you otherwise wouldn't have, because a company that is huge and has no competitor has absolutely no incentive to offer you that right, because they get more benefits from collecting that data and targeting ad revenue, etc., than they get from the alternative. So that's the clear point there, right? You get a huge number of benefits there. But the second point is that you actually stop the exploitation of hate speech and crime. And there's a fleeting reference to this. Oh, it's time. Okay. So the end point of this, I've already mentioned, is that you massively undermine data localization laws, which means that you can have illiberal activities occurring abroad with absolutely no regulation. There's sufficient mechanization earlier for Mish to then whip and expand upon this without new mechanisms. So hopefully he can go and explain why it's debate winning as well, because it relies on initial mechanisms prior to the post.
Thank you, member, for that speech. Can we have member of opposition?
Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. Let's be clear. The question of this debate is not what is and what isn't democratic. It is not what is and what isn't a harm. The question of this debate is, does breaking up companies fix the harms? And at this point in the debate, neither government team has linked their analysis of what is and isn't a democratic harm to the mechanism of making companies smaller. What we bring you in extension is the mind-boggling revelation that making these companies smaller or threatening to do this will in fact make their actions more undemocratic, harder to regulate, mutually exclusive to the set of available regulations which target these things without dabbling with the questions of this subjective metric in antitrust law. So 3 things I'm going to do in this speech. The first is to deal briefly with CG. The second is to talk about the opening half clash and why there are in fact alternatives that are available and capable of being implemented, which deals with any identified problems. And the third thing to do is to say why it will get worse in 3 main ways. Firstly, on CG. Look, the problem with CG here is they just kind of pick a new example of an undemocratic thing and then fall to all the same problems their opening has. For example, they never really tell us why privacy is a constitutional or democratic right. For example, it seems strange to me that privacy is protected to the extent the police can enter my house because I have reasonable suspicions, or supermarkets have cameras, or I can post whatever I want on Facebook, or I can sell my autobiography for money because I'm allowed to sell or consent to violations of my privacy. And secondly, they never prove why these things actually violate my privacy. For example, the fact that I actually click a button that is consenting to a contract that says I can violate my privacy in these ways. Thirdly, they never prove that this particular mechanism will fix these privacy reductions. For example, it is very unclear, and I will essentially do this more explicitly, why telling companies they cannot do this will not make them, just for example, incorporate in another state, which means they can do this in a way that is available to them to acquire data. Fourthly, they never tell us why there are not viable alternatives. For example, it would be very easy to pass a law which says something like consumers can opt into a priced model in which they do not have their data collected, which is essentially what the alternative is anyway. And fifthly, it is not even clear why it is particularly bad to collect this set of data. Data like my keystrokes on the computer, data like what I'm Googling for on the internet, data like things I'm publicly doing on a public forum, being the media and being technology. And to the extent that I'm consenting to those things, they are essentially public places, and it is not clear why those are democratic. It is not clear how any of that material can stand. Secondly, then, on the opening half clash, listen. This question about subjectivity, which I'll note here, the opening opposition, which is the main harm, which is that now you give a subjective metric to agencies, which allows them to impart the standard of democracy on companies when governments are afraid of things through the visage of transparency, is one that obviously falls in the answer of, obviously, being undemocratic is not a helpful metric to the extent it is subjective. But the real question is not whether this is a good metric, it is whether these harms can be addressed only by making companies smaller. And neither CG or OG's harms are exclusive to breaking up a company. First, things like viral misinformation on platforms can be easily passed by regulations like limiting liability on platforms to misinformation, things like algorithm regulations about the ways they set things up, things like fake news standards, like or labels that have to be imposed upon regulations post upon post. Secondly, that political lobbying can be fixed, like caps upon maximum donations, which already exist. Transparency upon things like donations, the extent to which a single company can advocate a particular point. Things like monopolies can be fixed by caps on markets, which exist often within media markets around the world, and those can be addressed through other forms of regulations. OG here says it is impossible for 2 reasons, the first being market dominance, but it is not clear why market dominance within a particular field actually correlates to the inability to legislate that field for 4 reasons. Firstly, because overwhelmingly market dominance means there is greater political capital to regulate you, because monopolies are something that are deeply unpalatable and the media has an incentive to scrutinize you. Secondly, because to the extent that you are a larger company or have a significant market share, that your competitors have an incentive to also regulate you to the extent they want to enter the market. And given those competitors and the individuals that want to have lower prices and consumers can be easily persuaded in that way. Thirdly, that often these companies want these forms of regulations. It is not good for Facebook to have viral misinformation on its site. It is not profitable for it, and to the extent they can regulate certain things, they are likely to apply. And fourthly, because it looks particularly bad if they opt out of those forms of regulations because it alienates their consumer base. So at that point, there are viable alternatives to the specific types of harms that these teams care about, whether or not they are democratic or not. Thirdly then, on why this is actually likely to make it more undemocratic. We have 3 mechanisms here as to why this is likely to happen. Firstly, dealing with the types of companies in the sense that they do actually break up, why the particular harms these teams have identified actually get worse. In terms of viral misinformation, it is sufficient to say that like if Facebook or tech companies break up, it is not like there are going to be new market entrants into the market. These are established brands, they have goodwill, they have consumer recognition, and they already have data so they know exactly how to comprise their market segments so they can create small companies that target specifically to those segments in a way that makes them perfectly competitive at their scale. And it's actually harder to compete with them when you're competing at the same economy of scale as opposed to a small entrant and a big market, because in that case you can create a niche market space for yourself, which makes it harder for new entrants to interrupt or disrupt the kinds of market models they have, for example, data acquisition. But secondly, that to the extent they're now small and still very market viable, they have greater capacity to disseminate viral information because they no longer have the ability to be called out because there's less likely to be scrutiny and less likely to be viral information. And secondly, that even when there's not fake news, there is still weighted news, which is the harm of privacy acquisition to the extent it is your algorithm. And then you will only receive in your specific market segment the algorithm which reinforces your opinion. Whereas when it's big and global, then you are more likely to stumble upon the opposite opinion or the opposite perspective, which means you're more likely to have discourse within the way that you exist. Secondly, in terms of things like lobbying, making them smaller doesn't decrease the net amount of lobbying. It just means that it is easier for those companies to not go over the cap. So if anything, they have greater capacity to lobby. Secondly, it is far harder to enforce. Most companies do not want to risk being broken up, but they also still want to innovate and make money. So instead of opting out of the market, they are more likely to do things like incorporate overseas or otherwise bypass the laws in ways like operating on online forums or the ways like that. And to that extent, then firstly, the harms are you no longer get any kind of tax revenue, which means it's harder to enforce the democratic mandate. But secondly, it is far easier for them to bypass any regulations that you have and far harder for them to negotiate with them. Thirdly, to the extent that they're big instead of small, it's harder to negotiate with them as an individual level to collectively agree to do something because you now have to deal with 30 arms. Fourthly and finally, now that you have given this subjective metric to agencies to enforce, you give governments fiat to enforce their standard of democracy upon the market, which allows them to do things like interfere with markets, which challenge them, which subvert them, which interfere with their personal rights, or are able to enact policy by bypassing parliament through this metric, which is the harm of OO. At the end of this speech, who cares if it's democratic? It gets worse on their side.
Thank you for that speech. Can we have opposition whip? Pardon me, government whip.
Okay, give me 1 second. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay. If Maddie had spent more time listening than proselytizing, she would have known from Connor's speech that there is no clear data sovereignty private policy. On the 20th of July, the European Court of Justice determined in Schrems 2 that in using Facebook, a European's data can be exported to the US, subsequently to a data processing facility in the Gulf. You can be identified, an offshore company can buy that identified data, and you are disclosed. CO missed the very basic observation from us that you do not have sovereignty over your data. So the legislative guarantees that you voted for cannot be enforced when you have offshore conglomerates. At the most basic level, we can win on the most basic premise that we localize data protection agencies by decompressing the data transfer outside of your country. That wins us alone because you voted for legislative protections. You need some sort of justiciable mechanism. The only way you can do that is to have the data protection agency in the country in the first place. That wins us its debate. but I'm going to systematically demolish all three sides in this debate. One, OG, and the lack of a mechanism, sticking point on defining what democracy is. Secondly, OO, and really their lack of a compelling response to many of the mechs that OG like allude to, and CO's weird extension, which I'll get to in the last couple of minutes. Opening government, the lack of mechanism and a sticking point on defining what democracy is. They say that misinformation abounds. OO is right in saying this suffers from the ambiguity of what democracy requires. Misinformation is amorphous if it is preference maximizing. The more fundamental democratic right is the one that we provide in our extension. That is privacy. Only in having the option to conceal your democratic preferences so that you cannot be targeted on the basis of protected characteristics and preferences, intimidated, etc. At the subtle level, and I'm going to stratify this at 3 levels to make sure that CO understand it, because apparently it wasn't clear enough for them first. At the subtle level, this is the US government under FISA being able to sequester data from a European or even from a US citizen, gerrymander based on high dimensionality data that is centralized within one database. That is gerrymandering at the fundamental level, an infraction against democracy. Our mechanism here is one of salience. When you break up the individual companies, you need to articulate a logic for data privacy that is currently diffuse and centralized, which means you end up decentralizing the collection of that data and also enshrining protections, for example, against the arbitrary surveillance of FISA. Every time I give a mechanism, that is one more nail in the coffin of CO. Secondly, at the middle level, access to data, jurisprudential recourse is a fundamental democratic right. If my data is held in the US as a European, I cannot carry a cross-border civil suit against Facebook US. For one, the refusal to delete my data. 2, not heeding data minimality and finality regulations. 3, the rights to be forgotten. Irrespective of whether Maddie wants to contend that these are fundamental democratic rights, they're legislations that the European Union and Europeans within it voted explicitly for in the first place under the GDPR. So a fundamental tenet of democracy is that people can carry a suit against their aggriever when the grievance is explicitly against the legislation that they themselves voted into that demolishes any of the response that was given to our mechanism. Our mechanism here is, by breaking up conglomerates, we would also assert data sovereignty. That is, unlike now, as an Irish citizen under our side, you can enforce your rights, which you are constitutionally endowed against Facebook, by going to the data processing factory of Facebook, the Irish wing, which only deals with your messages rather than your photos, your messengers, your geolocalization. So you go to the data protection agency and you have the right to justiciably enforce that within your jurisdiction. That wins us the debate at the most fundamental level, but it's about the enforcement of legislation which you voted for. But at its most extreme, and this also received no engagement from a flippant Maddie, Saudi Arabia is able to require from the US data on their citizenry from an individualized central database because all of the data is collated on Facebook. So they can find the dimensionality to identify whether or not you are Shia and suppress you on the basis of you being Shia. So where there was this really amorphous clash at OG and OO as to what's democratic, what's not, we transcend this clash and also beat CO in the wake because we give you a mechanism. We say that you cannot aggregate data within individual places with the high dimensionality that allows you to pinpoint specific people in specific locations without recourse across borders. That is at its most fundamental level what this antitrust policy does. Our other mechanism here, which again is not responded to, is Facebook no longer transcends borders. They don't have complete data sovereignty, which means it now becomes a different calculus to enter Saudi Arabia in the first place when Saudi Arabia has to set up a data privacy agency, which is in conformity with data privacy regulations, unlike referring to just the US centralized database that you would otherwise have in the absence of these antitrust laws. Why do we beat OG and OO? OO have mudslinging on why democracy is difficult to parameterize, but we transcend that by telling you why this is no longer a sticking point of democracy when the legislative link is very clear. You voted for a legislation in Europe, you can't enforce that right. We give you the ability to enforce that right when you split up, de-individualize, and also create data protection agencies within individual jurisdictions. Maddie says we never told you why privacy is enshrined. It's in the Constitution, and the Constitution is the formation of a democracy. I don't really know what more you want from a definition of democracy. Lastly, you compete to offer better services, which is our last mechanism that Connor gives you. That is, importantly, when I as an individual deciding to log into Facebook, I have to choose whether to concede a bundle of my rights for a bundle of networking benefits. Under our side, you concede 1 or 2 rights at your own choice and at your own liberty that can be enforced. That is a mechanism that again beats CO, they say that you have counterfactual types of regulation. 1, corporate capture, not responded to. You cannot wait against the corporate capture when they control everyone's data privacy in one individual setting. You need to literally break them up so that you can carry court cases against them in the first place. That's our point about justiciability. Even as a government to carry a case against Facebook, you need Facebook to hold data processing agencies within your country in the first place. That's part of antitrust. Second of all, you cannot enforce where these companies are too influential and people don't conceptualize the trade-off they're making in data privacy. The other mechanism is one of salience. That is to say, if it's more salient that data privacy is something you can change your price for, you're more likely to choose counterfactual services to Facebook in the first place. And thirdly, this is extrajudicial. That is to say, you literally cannot prosecute a case against Facebook Island. They say you can cultivate a niche market space under the status quo. Untrue. You can't compete with prominence. And second of all, you can be subsumed. Facebook can quite literally buy you out. This is what the antitrust regulation protects against. Lastly, they say more companies equals more lobbying, which misses the status quo. That is, companies don't even lobby. They just go straight and buy out super PACs and pay out for data protection. In terms of intervening on foreign markets, we comprehensively win that by talking about the justiciability of rights. At the end of this debate, the mechanism is incredibly clear. We allow for the enforcement of rights that are legislatively enshrined. That is the priority in the debate about democracy and what you vote for being delivered. So proud to propose.
Thank you. Can we have up clip?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Violating privacy is not anti-democratic, nor is it anti-anyone's constitution as far as I know. It's not in our constitution, it's not in America's constitution. You can DM me the part of the constitution now. I don't mind if you Google it because I'll love looking at the defeated look on your face during the rest of my speech. But it does sound like it is anti-consumer welfare, which is very odd, but let's not go there. It will make it too hard. There are much cleaner ways for us to win this debate than to prove that your mechanism actually is maybe an extension for us, but definitely not an extension for you. The first thing is about privacy. The first thing they say about privacy is that we should break up corporations nationally so that they can't share your data overseas. But one problem is that companies don't share their data internally within their company because that's not how you make a profit. Actually, the way you make a profit is by selling to another company. For example, a company overseas. So breaking them up by nation will not hurt at all. And importantly, breaking up the internet by nation is also a famously very bad idea. It makes it difficult to export democracy and democratic ideas overseas and for people to access other people overseas. But even if it did work, it would not stop privacy breaches for the exact reasons that this team gives, which is that you can still sell data offshore to other companies and that it is very difficult to regulate that. The second thing they say about data privacy is essentially that it's very hard to sue on it, and that means that we're justified in making any which type of laws that attempt to poke away at it. This is not true for a number of reasons. Firstly, imperfect enforcement of legislation is not undemocratic. There are many, in fact, every law is imperfectly enforced. This does not mean that it is undemocratic. If a law is unable to be enforced in any case, it just means that it is a shittily designed law. It does not mean that we need to give another terribly designed law in order to fix it. And that's why, for example, Maddie said that the police can't enter your house to check if you have drugs any which way that they want, because it is not bad for democracy to not be able to catch every drug dealer, even though we all democratically agreed that we're anti-drugs. Imperfect design of the law is not anti-democratic. Next, and importantly, even if it was anti-democratic to not be able to enforce the law, you can enforce regulations that about breaches of data privacy better on our side of the house. Firstly, for the several unrebutted pieces of argumentation that Maddie gives you about regulation, and then for two more that I will give you in this speech. The first is that when you have one big company like Facebook, you're able to amass a number of people who are wronged by that company in order to do a class action. And because it is such huge news, that is when you're more likely to get lawyers and people around it. When you segment into many smaller companies, there is much less political capital for you to ever have those actions in the first place. So their mechanism doesn't even work. But even if you were trying to, for example, sue these companies for breaching your privacy, we think that they would literally win the law cases, right? If you're trying to find them, they would literally win, and it will just hollow out antitrust legislation for every other company for which it is benefiting. So their mechanism not only doesn't work, but then gives Facebook a platform in court to mean that no other company can be broken up, even when it is hurting the democratic process. Lastly, we think that their mechanism is bizarrely circular. Like, if you're relying on the fact that Facebook cannot be taken to court, then why would you use a court process such as suing them under antitrust legislation as the way to get them? And if not, you're taking them to court under this very specific law, which every team has said that they could probably argue against in court. So that is why it is easier under our side of the house to sue someone for their breaking of anti-privacy legislation. But also, importantly, anti-privacy privacy was not the biggest issue in this debate, for the reason that the consumer has chosen to have a product which does not protect their privacy. Why is this true? At CG, they tell you that a new company might come up which could brand itself as the pro-privacy social media, which is laughable, because if this was something that you could make and that people wanted, some guy at Harvard would have already made it. And you might be saying, well, the reason that some dude at Harvard hasn't already profited off this is because it's not profitable if you're not selling data. Well, heaps of startups are not profitable. For example, Uber, they kind of become important because they have a lot of clicks, because they have a lot of consumers. If the consumers are interested, that usually means their share price goes up. But with this case, literally no one cares. So the idea that we are not doing some law that everyone cares about and that's undemocratic is literally not true. So all that will happen is consumers will choose another very similar company which will get really big, and that is very harmful because it creates this nightmare scenario where instead of 3 or 4 big competing companies that are always slightly overtaking each other, you have 15 small companies which CG has mashed into little bits, and then one bigger and more evil one. I'll take OG.
So, you may think that our policy doesn't necessarily work, but then what is your alternative mechanism for dealing with lobbying, regulatory capture, and misinformation, given that all previous mechanisms have not worked thus far?
So we think that previous mechanisms have worked to at least some extent. That's why people are more aware of fake news than ever. And Facebook has, for example, committed to targeting fake news on its site. But also democracy is also doing pretty well. People are more democratically informed. There's protests in the street because the youth care about the parties. I feel like voter turnout's going to be pretty big this year. So I don't really think that, you know what I think. So essentially, the idea that they will have more regulatory capture is also not proven for the exact reason that Maddie gives you, which is that these smaller companies that you mash them into still have mutual interests. So they're still likely to lobby in the same way, and they're still likely to band together on issues like net neutrality. And finally, access to media is good for democracy. And if you can no longer sell data, the only thing that you can do is monetize in ways that make this more expensive for the consumer, which is which means that people have less access to their democracy. And in the meantime, while you've ruined Facebook, it turns out that some other company becomes really big in its state. That's why anti-monopoly legislation ends up leading to more monopolies. So at the end of this speech, their mechanism literally doesn't work. I literally care more about Facebook than my government, spend more time invested in it, and care about it more than any data I've ever given it away. Please don't hurt my one source of distraction and fun. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for the debate. You guys can return to the main room, and the ORCOM will call you back when the deliberation is ready.
What's going